Good evening, members, and welcome to tonight's head-to-head debate on the age-old question, does God exist? First, before I talk a little about the motion tonight and give you a little preamble in introducing the speakers, a couple housekeeping rules. How tonight would work is that we're going to start with 20-minute submissions from both speakers, starting from the proposition speaker, and then we allow for 10-minute rebuttals from both speakers, starting from the proposition speaker, and then finally a 5-minute closing statement from both speakers, again starting from the proposition speaker. Hopefully, given the time permits, there might be chances for 1 or 2 audience questions that must be proposed to both speakers. So think about that when you are chosen for your question. So, does God exist? This head-to-head debate will reflect on an age-old question which has been considered by the philosophers and theologians for millennia. Does God exist? Our 2 speakers will discuss the philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God, from a moral and logical arguments to those proposed by observed phenomena of the universe. Speaking first is Professor Richard Swinburne. Professor Richard Swinburne is an emeritus professor of philosophy of the Christian religion at the University of Oxford. He's an influential proponent of philosophical arguments for the existence of God and authored the Coherence of Theism, the Existence of God, and Faith and Reason. Speaking in opposition is Professor Peter Millican. He's the Gilbert Wright Fellow and Professor of Philosophy at Harvard College. He questions the existence of God and is known for his work on David Hume, philosophy of religion, and moral philosophy. Could you join me in welcoming both of our speakers? I'd like to welcome our first proposition speaker, Professor Richard Swinburne, to make the case for why God does exist. Thank you.
My reason for believing that there is a God is that the hypothesis that there is a God is the simplest and so most probable explanation of the existence of our universe and of its most general features. Most probable by the criteria of probability used in science, history, in other inductive inquiries. There are 2 kinds of way in which we explain the occurrence of phenomena. I call them inanimate and personal. The inanimate way, which is the used in the physical sciences, is you explain a state of affairs by a previous state of affairs and the operation on it of laws of nature. Thus, you may explain why the planets are where they are now because of where they were last year and the operation of Newton's laws. But there's a different way in which we explain quite a lot of phenomena, and that's what I call personal explanation. We explain various phenomena by the action of a person or other animate being who has purposes and beliefs about how they can be fulfilled and certain powers. Thus, if I wave my hand and you want an explanation of why I'm waving my hand, the explanation is I've got the power to wave my hand. I've got the purpose of drawing your attention and the belief that if I do wave my hand, I will get your attention. So purposes, beliefs, and powers enter into the explanation. These 2 kinds. Now, for both kinds, the criteria are roughly the same, and they are on the handout, which at the top of the handout, which should be available to you. In both cases, the criteria for that some hypothesis H is probable is that insofar as it is probable, you would expect the data, the phenomena which you observe. And insofar as it's not probable, you wouldn't expect the phenomena. That is to say, you've got evidence, phenomena, and if it's the sort of evidence that follows from the hypothesis or is made probable by the hypothesis, you would expect it. And if it's the sort of evidence that is made probable only if the hypothesis is false, you wouldn't expect it. But thirdly, it has to be a simple hypothesis. I'll come back to what that involves in a moment. But also it has to fit in with the background knowledge. That's to say, if you're explaining some rather narrow phenomenon, such as why a particular person did a particular thing on a particular occasion, you have to bring in all sorts of other information about what sort of person he was like, not merely the data which the hypothesis leads you to explain. Now, a couple of examples of this. I usually have a detective example. Suppose there's been a robbery, a safe robbery. Detective is investigating this, and he finds that someone, Jones, was seen near the scene of the crime at the time it was committed. His fingerprints are on the safe, and the money of a value equal to the amount stolen was found in his house. So the detective concludes Jones did the murder. No, did the robbery. Yes, but the defending barrister, when he appears in court, says there's a perfectly good explanation of all these phenomena you draw attention to. It wasn't really Jones. He has an identical twin. No, we can't produce him, but he does have one. Fingerprints, well, there's someone I know who can plant fingerprints on safes, and he's been planting fingerprints on safes just to get people into trouble. And yes, the amount of money was of the same amount as was stolen, but it was stolen in another robbery by somebody else who hid it in Jones's house. Now, for both these rival hypotheses, it is the case that my first two criteria are satisfied. If either hypothesis was true, you would expect to find the phenomena which I've described, and if they were false, you wouldn't expect. But why do we prefer the obvious first explanation? And the answer is it's simpler. A simple hypothesis is one which postulates few entities, few kinds of entities, few properties, few kinds of properties, mathematically simple numbers, mathematically simple functions. And the hypothesis I propose postulates only one person whose actions cause these phenomena, whereas the rival hypothesis is postulating three people who are doing quite unconnected things, and that's why we prefer the first hypothesis. This kind of explanation is also operative in the sciences. Why do you postulate certain laws of nature? Well, you postulate the simplest laws of nature that you can. Newton's theory of gravitation was a very simple theory, had three laws of motion and its law of gravitational attraction. The law of gravitational attraction says bodies are attracted to each other by forces proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart. And that, by scientific standards, is a very simple hypothesis. But there are an infinite number of hypotheses which will also enable you to predict just those same data. For example, if we, instead of saying that the distance apart is inversely proportional to the square, you could say it's inversely proportional to 2 to the power 0.0000001. And as far as anybody could measure data in Newton's days, that would have given just the same predictions. Or you could say that it's proportional to two forces, one inversely proportional to the square of the distance apart, another proportional to the square of the inversely proportional to the cube of the distance apart, but there's a constant in front of the cube element such that the constant doesn't tick in, as it were, until the year 2030, when there is a cubic force of repulsion, of attraction between the bodies. Well, obviously we go for Newton's law. Why? Because it has only one term in it, the term is a simple number, and so on and so on. The fourth criterion, as I say, only comes in when you're dealing with a narrow hypothesis, such as who did the robbery. But when you're dealing with a big scientific hypothesis, there is no background knowledge to take in. Okay, so that's how we explain things. Now, the four features of the universe which need explanation are mentioned on my handout, under E at the bottom. There is a physical universe. It's governed by very simple laws of nature. Those simple laws of nature are such as to lead to the evolution of us. We are conscious beings, and so there are innumerable laws which connect goings on in our brain with thoughts and feelings and so on. My hypothesis is there is a God, an essentially everlasting, omnipotent person, and it follows from that, though I won't demonstrate it here, that he's omniscient, that it also follows from it that he's perfectly good. The reason why it follows that he's perfectly good is that if he's really omnipotent, there aren't any forces acting on him from without, as it were. He's not subject to irrational desires, and therefore, seeing something is good, he will do it. We are subject to all sorts of irrational desires, and we may or may not do good actions. So, my hypothesis is that a perfectly good God is responsible for this. Why should such a God bring about us? Well, we are good things. We are rational, conscious creatures who can make a difference to things, and that's very good. But we also have the peculiarity from God's point of view that we have a character, a feature of our character, which even God does not have, but is nevertheless a virtue. Insofar as we are good or wise or powerful, God is better, wiser, more powerful. So why should he make beings who are less powerful, etc.? Well, there's a good reason, of course, but there is one characteristic we have that he does not have. God can do no evil. We have a choice between good and evil, frequently have a choice, and that's what makes us so different. And God would have a reason for making that, because God doesn't want us to be programmed to do what is good. He wants us to choose what is good. And therefore, if we are to make serious choices, we must have a choice between good and evil. We have to make serious choices to the world. And he would want to allow us to make serious choices to the world and each other, and so he has a good reason for creating us. He is, as I emphasized, a very simple being. A person is a being with powers, beliefs, and purposes, who last for a certain length of time. God, being essentially everlasting, exists for a length of time to which there are zero limits, and zero is a very simple number. He has infinite powers, that is to say, to his powers there are zero limits. So he has powers and knowledge and freedom to choose, subject to not doing evil, on which there are zero limits, and as I demonstrated, his goodness follows from that. Okay, so simple hypothesis. He has reason for making us, yes, but if there are to be us, we need bodies, and therefore there must be a physical universe. If there is to be us, we need to be able to make a difference to things, and that means things have to behave in a regular way. If every time we did something with our hands or feet, we couldn't predict what would happen afterwards, we wouldn't be able to make a difference to anybody or anything else. So the world on the reasonable macro scale has to be a pretty regular place. Has to be the case that if you light a fire and set it to the crops will burn. If you light a fire and put it under your cooking pot, then things will cook. And generally, the world has to be a regular place, which it only will be if the laws of nature at a lower level are simple. How likely is it that if there was no God, there would be such a universe? Very, very unlikely, because consider what it means to say that there are laws of nature operative. To say, for example, that Newton's law of gravitation operates. It's to say that every material body everywhere in the universe, of which there may well be an infinite number, but certainly an enormous large number, behaves in exactly the same way, in the sense that it attracts every other body in accordance with that law. If it was a mere chance matter that these things were occurring, there might be, every particle might be going its own way, like as if you have a pack of cards, there's no order to them. So there is every reason to suppose that if there was no ultimate source of this order, it wouldn't be there. And even if it was there, there's not the slightest reason to suppose it would be the kind of laws which lead to the evolution of us. And my hypothesis is God does produce us, and as we know, he produces us by producing the laws of evolution, which produce us. And we are conscious beings, and there's nothing in physics which will possibly explain or could possibly explain, without bringing in innumerable other categories, why that is the case. And so why should we expect it? Well, if there's a God, we have every reason to expect it, because that's what our being, that's why we're valuable, because we are conscious beings. So there is every reason to suppose that if there is a God, it's quite probable that we would find these phenomena that we do. It's not at all probable, not in the least probable, that if there's no God, we wouldn't, that we would find these phenomena. And it's a very simple hypothesis, and we don't need the fourth criterion for the obvious reason that God is postulated as the explanation of everything. So, but couldn't there be some, I've talked about personal explanations, couldn't there be some inanimate type of explanation? Well, the problem there is there's only one way in which laws of nature can be explained, and that's by other laws of nature. The very nature, you can explain Galileo's law by the operation of Newton's law, and maybe you can explain the operation of Newton's law by the laws of relativity theory. But you can only explain in the inanimate pattern where you explain by laws of nature and initial conditions. The only way you can explain laws of nature is by laws of nature. And these are regularities in the behavior of things which are very coincidental if there is no God. And so you wouldn't get a simple explanation. So the simplest and most probable explanation of all these phenomena which I have mentioned are the operation of God as creator, keeping, starting the universe off if it had a starting point, or if it didn't, keeping it in operation throughout all eternity, keeping the laws of nature operative, and these leading to us. But you will no doubt be thinking, not everything in the universe is good. There's a lot of evil, a lot of suffering and wrongdoing. And how can my hypothesis explain that if God is supposed to be perfectly good? Well, as I said, God gives us freedom, free will to do good or evil. But a free will where you could just make decisions which didn't make any difference to the world wouldn't be particularly worth having. What's valuable about us is that we can make an enormous difference to the world. And if God is not to program us to produce good, but really wants us to be co-creators, and it's surely good that he should be, then he must allow us to do evil as well as good. And that is to say, he must allow us to harm not merely ourselves, but each other and the world. And but of course, there is other sorts of evil, natural evil, as it's called. The evil of disease, accident, and so on, for which humans are not responsible. Not always. Moral evil, the evil that humans are responsible for, does include not merely the evil they deliberately bring about, but the evil that they, through negligence, allow to occur. But there is plenty of suffering which is not the fault of humans. So what's the point of that? Well, the point of that is just this, as far as we're concerned. If I am suffering from some disease or other, which is nobody's fault, my friends have a choice. They have a choice of whether to be sympathetic and try and get me cured, or whether to ignore me and be callous. And I have a choice of how to deal with this, whether patiently or not patiently. If the only evils in the world were those created deliberately by humans, we wouldn't have a great deal of choice. Humans are not totally wicked people. So it does need natural evil, which provides the opportunity for either doing nothing about it or doing something about it. And that is the value of most natural evil. But I've said that it's a good thing that we have free choices, and sure it is, and that's very important. But there is another thing to notice about these free choices. Each time we make a good free choice, it's easier of a certain kind, it's easier to make a good free choice next time, and conversely. If I tell a lie once, it's easier to tell a lie again. If, on the other hand, I'm courageous once, it's easier to be courageous next time. And so, the good of our free will is not just the good of the individual action, it's the good of we make ourselves. And God wants us to make ourselves. He wants us to not merely to make a great difference to the world, but to make a great difference to us, to make us the sort of people who would be worth keeping alive forever. But whether or not he keeps us alive forever, as I think he does, but whether or not that is the case, the worth of our life doesn't consist in solely, or indeed mainly, in the experiences we have. It consists in the actions we do to help other people, and the actions that we do to improve ourselves. And in the course of time, we make ourselves. And it's very good that we're able to do this. And the direct moral evil and natural evil enable us to do this. I think I'll stop there. And I have something to say about animal suffering, but I think I'll wait till my next innings for that purpose.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to invite the opposition speaker, Professor Peter Millican, to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the Oxford Union for inviting me to debate with Professor Richard Swinburne this afternoon. Richard is, in my view, the most distinguished philosopher of religion alive today, and one of the most influential natural theologians ever. So it's an honour to be discussing with him head to head. We have debated in the Union before, almost exactly 8 years ago, on whether religion harms society. But we first argued head-to-head around 42 years ago, when I was a final year undergraduate of philosophy and theology, invited by Professor Basil Mitchell to present arguments against Richard when he visited our weekly class. The topic of my critical essay was his most famous book, The Existence of God, published shortly before in 1979, and that's my copy. That book developed from Richard's wild lectures of 1976 and 1977, the second series of which took place during my first year at Oxford. So his thinking about natural theology and the existence of God has been part of my life for a very long time, and always prominent on my reading lists since I started teaching philosophy of religion. When I first heard Richard's lectures in 1977, I was a believer, anxiously worrying whether my belief was any better founded than that of the Christian Union fundamentalists I had recently encountered for the first time. They had shocked me with their simple-minded credulity in a Bible which I knew well as containing numerous obvious falsehoods. Consequent anxiety about the rationality of my own belief made me hugely interested in Richard's arguments, and later motivated my change of degree programme from mathematics to philosophy and theology. After several years wrestling with my doubts, and despite the ingenuity of Richard's arguments, I ultimately found the atheist reasonings of David Hume more persuasive, which subsequently played a significant role in shaping the course of my career as a philosopher and Hume scholar. Given this context, therefore, I propose to focus all my attention today on Richard's own theistic arguments, and will not consider those that he's not emphasised in his own works, such as the ontological argument, on which I think we pretty much agree. Nor shall I argue for atheism quite generally. I shall target exclusively his own theistic position and ignore alternative doctrines that he rejects, such as that God is outside time or omniscient about future free human actions. So I'm treating this as an opportunity, a very welcome opportunity, to question Richard and probe him specifically on the ingenious arguments that he's given. And I want to go through, just rehearse some of the key moves there and make some comments on them. I did a rather large handout. I was expecting actually to be able to project things and kind of talk about them. I don't intend to read everything on the handout. If you want the handout and don't have it, I shall put it online on www.millican.org shortly. But it contains quotations from various passages from Richard's works. Obviously, I did not know in advance exactly what he would be saying today. Okay, so first of all, Richard says there are two kinds of explanation, which he calls personal and inanimate. And the idea is that since the physical world cannot be explained entirely by an inanimate explanation, because after all, we're trying to explain everything in the inanimate world, we are driven back to personal explanation as the only alternative. And indeed, he wants to say that it is a satisfactory alternative. So a couple of points I just want to make here by observation. I mean, first of all, there are other methods of explanation. I mean, for example, one can have purposive explanation of the behavior of an inanimate object, such as a chess computer. You know, why did it play that move? And the perspicuous explanation of why it played a particular move is usually not in terms of the electronics, it's in terms of the laws of chess and the fact that it's been following a certain algorithm. Notice also that one can have inanimate systems that have evolved in such a way that their behavior is purposive, animals and plants being obvious cases. In many cases, that behavior can be explained by things like the logic of evolution. So the idea that it's all either mechanical or personal is incorrect, but I'm not sure that Richard would have any objection to that. It's simply an observation I make. Now, Richard puts a huge emphasis on simplicity. It's a very clever move because he's reacting to the arguments, for example, of David Hume in the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, where Hume says, well, look, the most natural analogy to the world, if you want to find an analogy in the human sphere, is the construction of very large things like castles or ships, or not small things, not like clocks. And large things are characteristically made by lots of people combining together. So actually, if you want to carry the analogy over to the universe, you'd expect there to be lots of gods. And Richard's ingenious move here is to say, well, the key thing about theism is its simplicity. And so he emphasizes simplicity as the criterion above all else, which determines the probability, or the prior probability at least, in advance of looking at the detailed evidence, of the theistic hypothesis. Now, on the handout, I've given various quotations by Whitehead, Bunger, and Hesse. Harray, Ron Harray, once of this university, denying that actually the history of science shows simplicity as being such a useful criterion. Very often in the history of science, we've gone from simple hypotheses to more complex ones. A related point is that simplicity is actually multifaceted. There are different types of simplicity. Let me just give one example of this variety. You can have descriptive or syntactic simplicity or complexity. That is, how concisely can the hypothesis that you're giving be specified? Or there's a different kind of thing, which is ontological simplicity. So that's to do with how simple or complex is the reality or the mechanism which is being hypothesized. And they may be different things. They may come apart. Another question that can be asked is, how simple or complex would the mechanism need to be according to our current best understanding? So that relates to sort of issues like complexity theory. Certain processes are inherently more complex than others. So even if you can describe it very simply, it may be that the actual carrying out of the procedure has a lot more complications behind. Now, a key point of Richard's emphasis on simplicity, or the other side of that coin, is he denies that in assessing the plausibility of theism, one should take any account of our background knowledge of the world. And it's a nice point. He says, since you're explaining the entire universe, you don't need to worry about there being surrounding fields with which your theory needs to cohere. So therefore, we can postulate a theory which does not cohere with things that we see in the world as the cause of the universe. Now, the problem with this is it opens the door to intuitively simple but magical explanations that operate unlike anything we know in our experience, through instantaneous action across the entire universe by the pure will of an omnipotent deity, and without any intermediate causal mechanism. That's completely unlike our experience. We are intentional beings, but we operate through bodies that work by physical action. The idea that there can be a being who just by divine fiat can make things happen across the entire universe instantaneously is radically out of line with our experience. And I want to challenge this move of saying actually fit with background knowledge doesn't matter. I don't think that fits with the history of science. In fact, the history of science has been a long retreat from purposive explanations. Aristotle thought that stones fall because they are striving to reach the center of the universe, that planets go in circles because they are striving to imitate the perfection of the creator, and so forth. These theories have proved to be hopeless. Now, they do seem to us very simple. They seem to us very simple because we are naturally prone to what's been described as promiscuous teleology. An example, you take a young child and you say, here's a question, why do mountains exist? Is it A, to give animals a place to climb, or B, because volcanoes cooled into lumps? And children invariably prefer the purposive explanation. Likewise, why is the sun in the sky? To keep us warm. What are trees for? To provide shade, and so on. It's absolutely natural for us to be attracted to the purposive explanation. And indeed, Alzheimer's patients revert to childhood in that respect. So we naturally find purposive explanations very, very simple and attractive. But the history of science suggests that they end up being barren. I mean, an example of a very simple explanation of the universe, just to parody this, is the following. There is an omnipotent creator who wants things to be exactly as they are. So what's the explanation of why there's a cup of water here? Well, because the omnipotent creator wanted there to be a cup of water there. That's an example of how you can get a very, very simple explanation, but it's hopeless because it's so non-specific. Okay, an observation, of course, we do see a lot of genuine purposiveness in nature, but as I've said, that's explicable by Darwin, which we both accept, but that always works in combination with a physical understructure. Infinity. This is another clever move. Infinity, Richard claims, is the simplest hypothesis. If you're going to hypothesize a God, make it an infinite God, a God without limits. Well, infinity isn't so straightforward, as Georg Cantor discovered. Put that point to one side. The infinite God isn't so simple because it doesn't extend then to being able to do evil. It doesn't extend, according to Richard, to knowing the future actions of free agents. And also, I would suggest, it isn't computationally simple. We're talking here about a being which, on Richard's theory, maintains in being every single particle in the universe from moment to moment, while at the same time, whenever this being acts, he's calculating the optimum outcome of all the possible things that could happen using those innumerable things in the universe. I mean, the computational power implied there is absolutely stupendous. And simply to say, well, my theory is that it just happens by magic, doesn't seem to me to be plausible. But I'm going to put a particular challenge to Richard, which is that when infinities arise in the calculations of physicists, they don't embrace them. They don't say, oh, that's great, we've got an infinity there. They try to get rid of them, so-called renormalization. Another challenge I'd like to put to Richard, I'd really be intrigued to know what his answer to this is, because he rejects the theory that God is timeless on the grounds that it doesn't make sense to say that God is simultaneously aware of what is happening in AD 1995 and in 587 BC. But our best theory of space and time, general relativity, implies actually that simultaneity is relative. So if God knows everything that's happened up until time t, but from time t onwards cannot know the free actions of agents such as ourselves, how does that square with relativity theory? It seems to be implying that there is a simultaneous measure across the entire universe, which is something that seems not to be the case. So I want to come now, how much time do I have left?
17 minutes.
I'm sure I don't have 17 left. You mean 3? Yeah, fine. Okay, thank you. That would be nice. So I want to end for now on the issue of morality. Now, again, Richard has an ingenious argument. It is that since there is moral truth, an omniscient God would know what the moral truth is, and not being moved by any irrational desires would simply do what good requires, and therefore would be perfectly good. So this is part of his claim that the infinite, perfect, omnipotent, omniscient God would also be perfectly good. The goodness comes free because it's part of the package. Now, I'd like to know more about Richard's moral metaphysics and epistemology here, because he is postulating a view of morality which makes it a necessary a priori sphere, quite independent of the actual existence of humans. It's something that can influence God even in the absence of any empirical world. And I'm wondering how that makes sense, how such necessary truths could motivate us, how we could know about them. And I'd also like to hear more about the problem of evil, Richard. You talked in general terms about how it is a good thing that people should have the power to do morally significant things. But how are you going to square that with the fact that in history, an awful lot of people have not had much power to do morally significant things because they've starved as babies, or they've been exterminated by the Nazis, and so forth? That seems to me to be hard to explain on that basis. And at that point, I think I need to stop.
Well, I think the rules are I have only 10 minutes to answer these objections, and it will take me about 2 or 3 minutes to answer each of them, and there are a lot of objections, so I'm afraid I'll have to leave you with the floor on a number of them. Let's start at the beginning with the ones I've noted down. You said there are other ways of explaining things than the inanimate or the personal. And you mentioned one later on in the lecture, which you said wasn't any good, and that was Aristotle's explanation of why it rains to water the ground or whatever. That is to say, there's a lot of teleology in explanation of natural phenomena, not teleology in the sense of explaining it by somebody's purpose for the future, but explaining it by a future purpose, which is nobody's future purpose. And that doesn't seem to me to make sense, a purpose that's nobody's purpose. And even if it does make sense, all other explanations of that kind which have been around have been superseded by explanations of one of the two other kinds that I have mentioned. Aristotle's explanation is not with us. Evolutionary biologists often talk about the purpose of the eye and that sort of thing. But when you examine more closely, what they mean by that is that if the eye wasn't like that, it would have been eliminated, and it wasn't eliminated because it subserved some further function, which was a function which kept the animal alive. So I don't think there are any other explanations, or at any rate, any ones that don't quickly disappear, of any phenomenon. So these are the two. And it's pretty obvious to us that we often do things in order to achieve goals. And this is so obvious to us that it ought to be a datum rather than anything else. I am here because I promised to be here, and I sought to fulfill my promises. And we make plans for the near and far future, and we do things because we made these plans. So we obviously direct our lives by purposes, and our purposes are guided by our beliefs as to what will be the consequences of the actions for which we have powers. So I think there aren't any other kinds of explanation, of causal explanation, that is, of phenomenon. Now, you say that sometimes science prefers the less simple explanation. My view of simplicity, which I might have said out loud a little while ago, and which you might have quoted me, is that the simpler explanation is the more probable explanation, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the true explanation. We have three or four criteria involved. And of course, if your explanation, however simple, runs up against the data, runs up against phenomena occur which you haven't predicted, then you have to abandon the simple one and go for the next simple one. But the point is the simplest of which, for which the first two criteria are satisfied to some extent, is the most probable. And yes, science does sometimes move from more simple to complicated explanation. Very simple example, the Boyle-Charles law, PV equals KT, was superseded by the van der Waals law, in which there are a few more terms. Yes, why? Because the latter gave more accurate predictions. So, nevertheless, among hypotheses which do satisfy the first two criteria, scientists always do prefer the simpler one. I illustrated this on the handout I gave you with a very simple example. If you consider a scientist's task as finding how two variables are related to each other, and you consider the scientist as marking on a piece of graph paper observed values of y for observed values of x, and you find that when x is 1, then y is 2, and x is 2, then y is 4, and so on. Obvious explanation, which you could draw through the points on the graph, y equals 2x. Or is it the other way around on the paper? X equals 2y. Anyway, I have, y equals 2x, yeah. But there are an infinite number of curves which will pass through those points. And if you don't have that criterion for choosing, you could never make any prediction about anything at all, because compatible with anything you know so far, there are an infinite number of different ways you could extrapolate from it. Some of them are wild, most of them are pretty wild, but that's just the point. They are unsimple, and that's why scientists prefer it. And I can list a few scientists who have said that sort of thing, and they are, I think, a little more sensitive to what's going on than the scientists you have quoted on this. Einstein was very, very emphatic about simplicity, and in the end, most scientists will admit that. And inevitably, it's an a priori criterion, because it's criterion that the hypothesis has in itself, independent of its relation to other phenomena. Now, the next one I have put is, yes, well, we Peter objected to my dismissing all our knowledge of how things behave in the world, the wider field. That must be right, because the phenomena we are trying to explain are either phenomena of those that we're trying to explain, or the ones we're not trying to explain. And if the phenomena we're trying to explain covers more or less everything, then there isn't anything outside that scope. Small point, though, you said, how can God explain why this book's here rather than there? What I said was God was the most can explain the most general features of the universe, and I listed those. What that entails is that he is quite probable that he will produce laws of nature and so on, which and initial conditions and so on, which are such within the parameters that I set. That is to say, he will produce simple laws of nature, which will lead to the evolution of us and so on, but it doesn't say exactly which simple laws of nature. There may be half a dozen or something like that, or there may be different initial conditions which will that. That's not, I don't think that postulating God could explain the details of why a particular piece of dust is where it is, but what it can explain is why the laws of nature are such that why the laws of nature are such as to allow it to be there. And that is all that's involved. You say the laws of nature postulate all sorts of things that we are not familiar with in the world. That is true, but of course physics does exactly the same. Physics, modern theoretical physics, postulates entities behaving in quite extraordinary ways that you don't see on the large scale. Photons, which are both particles and waves. How can anything be a particle and a wave? You've never seen something that's a particle and a wave, but physics tells you, and physics' justification for that is if you postulate that, you can get all the phenomena which the physicists rely on. Have I got any more minutes?
You've got 30 more seconds.
Pardon? 30 more seconds, yeah. Okay, well, just one remark on infinity. What I said was, God is infinitely powerful and so on. My infinity was a characteristic of a property. Cantor, whom you brought in, who has a very complicated theory of the nature of infinity, was concerned with objects, and to define what it is there to be an infinite number of objects leads you a long way. I'm not postulating an infinite number of objects. I'm postulating one object, and I'm postulating zero limits to the properties it has. I could say a lot about morality, but no, I think it's your turn.
Better watch the mic. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to invite you to say a bit more about morality, and I just want to follow up on something you just said. You said that scientists prefer simple laws, but sometimes reject them because more complex law turns out to be more accurate. Sure. I agree with that entirely. I also agree that if you have two laws that are equally precise and accurate, equal scope and so on, then obviously you'd prefer the simpler one. But simplicity normally goes along with less precision, less specificity. And this is clearly true in the case, two of the cases you mentioned. So in the case of quantum mechanics, the supposition of wavicles, or whatever you call them, in quantum electrodynamics leads to predictions that are accurate to something like 10 decimal places or whatever. Experimental results just prove to be fantastically accurate. Whereas the problem with theism is, it seems to me, that it's so general that it's hard actually to say what would count against it. And here we come again to morality, and I'd like to say a little bit more about that. So we're talking about the issue of the problem of evil, and Richard's approach there is to say that it is actually a great good that people should have the power to do evil, and a good that they should have the power to do evil that can make significant harms for others. Now, Richard takes this quite a long way. So in a discussion with Bart Ehrman online, I'll just read what Richard said there. If our life is in some way of use to others by our suffering, as well as what we do, that's a great good for us. A great good for us, even though not the greatest. Coming to the starving children, by their availability to suffer, just as by the availability of the victims of the Holocaust to suffer, not merely were choices made for other people, but because those choices were made for other people, it was a great good for the victim that they were allowed to be agents who provided the opportunity for other humans to make choices for good or ill. If there wasn't the possibility of the children starving, then it wouldn't matter what we did with our money or with our lives or with anything. But because there is that possibility, it does matter. And those who are the vehicle, albeit the unknowing vehicle of this, are greatly benefited by that. Now, I find that kind of claim extraordinary because we've got here that appalling things are being licensed in order to provide significant moral freedom for some agents, the ones who are able to do great ill by slaughtering lots of them or bringing it about that they starve. And yet that is claimed here to be a good for the victims because they are a vehicle of enabling this moral seriousness. Now, I find that hard to square with any view of morality that I would endorse, but it also seems to me to be a serious problem for a different reason. So Richard holds that we are fundamentally souls, immaterial souls, who are, as it were, contingently attached to bodies. And when we die, our soul, if we deserve it at least, will go to heaven and be immortal and so forth, or at least potentially immortal. Now, that seems to me to be very, very hard to square with evolution. It seems to me extremely hard to square with the fine-tuning argument, which I know Richard endorses, but he's not talked about today. Incidentally, I think that's the most interesting and potentially strong argument there is for God. But it requires the hypothesis that God set things going in such a way that the world would evolve in so as to make it possible for complex life forms like us to evolve. But it's hard to see why you need to go through that long physical process of 13.8 billion years if ultimately the bit that matters just gets put in there by divine fiat, when a suitable body comes along and the soul gets created. So there needs to be some story about how the soul and the matter fit together that's going to make sense of the evolution of our enormous brains and why they are needed if the soul by itself, the immaterial soul, could do the thinking for us. But I want to end with a sort of speculation which seems to me to be in line with the sort of moral vision that Richard has been sketching. If it can be a good thing that some more powerful agent has the power over less powerful agents to make their lives miserable because it gives moral seriousness to the decisions of the more powerful agent, and if there can be immaterial agents, devils or whatever, fallen angels, then it seems to me we're back to a potentially to having demigods and demiurges who create earths like this as their playthings. And what happens to us is of relatively little moral account because we are providing vehicles for their moral seriousness. So obviously I'm not proposing that as a serious cosmogony. My point is simply that if you have a theory which allows such latitude, which allows such appalling things to happen and say those are perfectly consistent with an almighty, all-good God, then I fail to see how you can square the empirical evidence or claim that it points more in that direction than in the direction of a perfectly evil being. It seems to me that when you're allowing that much latitude in the explanation, you could explain away the good in the world by appeal to an evil being, just as Richard is explaining away the evil in the world by appeal to a perfectly good being. And in those circumstances, it seems to me the reasonable conclusion is that the cause or causes of order in the universe, as David Hume would say, actually don't care tuppence for either good or evil.
I'd like to invite Professor Swinburne to make his concluding
I
statement.
think I'm allowed 5 minutes to deal with all that. The world is a good place. There are a lot. Most people in the world are pretty good people, and they look after their families pretty well. Evil is a minor thing in the world, in the structure of things. The only being who has the right to allow us to suffer is our Creator. parents have a right to allow their children to suffer a little. They force discipline on them, and children don't like it very much. And the state, likewise, has certain very small rights. But the rights of state and children arise from their being, to some very small extent, the source of the existence of the children or whatever who suffer. God is the final and total source of these things. He is our total creator, and he's brought us to being out of nothing, and we should be grateful for that, whatever else happens. But it is a good for someone if they are of use to other people. Our generation, I think, finds it less easy to see that than other generations. But before the present generation in the Western world, it was regarded as a great good for someone if they were killed in a battle to save their country from a tyrannous oppressor. It was a good for them, quite apart from anything else. And they were thought their lives had had purpose and meaning that this was the case. And that was quite apart from whether the society believed in life after death or not. The very fact that life had been given for a purpose meant that it was a great life. So I don't apologize for the remarks that I was quoted, but I should add a further point to them, which is might alleviate some of the anxiety that I understand. And I really am not callous about the sufferings, which are very serious. But then the world is a serious place, and it's a serious matter what we make of ourselves. But what I would add to them is this: God is omnipotent. God is able to give us a life after death. Most of the major religions claim that he does do that. And if you think, and perhaps rightly think, that some of those who suffer, their lives were, as it were, better that they hadn't lived, then God has an obligation, as our creator, to give them a life after death. And that follows from his omnipotence that he will be able to do this. And it will be a compensation in the sense that their total life will be a good life. And I think most lives are in themselves on earth worth living and on balance. But if there are lives that aren't, and some of the ones you mentioned might be in that category, then God's obligation is simply to give us a life which on balance is a good life. And if it starts with some bad parts, well, that's for the sake of the good. Just as a surgeon might need to operate on a baby, and if he hasn't got anesthetics, it might cause the baby a great deal of pain. But that means the first part of the baby's life is better he hadn't lived. But the point is to save the baby's life and to go on to a further life. And if there are lives of ours in that category, then God will provide. And this is not an ad hoc addition to my theodicy. It's the common belief of almost all theistic religions. And it follows from the omnipotence of God that he can do this and that he will do this. So I am not too fazed by the latest points.
Thank you, Richard. I probably went a bit over last time, didn't I? So I'm all right, am I? Okay, fine, thank you. Okay, I want to address that last point about life after death, because it's an interesting one, and as you say, it has been a traditional view. But notice that there's a big tension. There's a big tension between saying, when we look at the empirical world, this demands explanation in terms of a perfectly moral creator. But at the same time, things are so awful in this world that there better be a life after death to make up for it. All right. I mean, it's like someone who goes into a restaurant and the starter is absolutely disgustingly horrible. And then they say, well, I can't wait for the next course because it must be brilliant to make up for it. No, you leave the restaurant, the rest will probably be the same. So the other point I want to make is there seems to be a big tension here, because Richard, I think, if I understand correctly, has the theory that life on Earth with our bodies is what enables us to be morally serious. It's because we have bodies that we can be harmed, in particular. I personally don't see why immaterial spirits shouldn't be subject to harm in ways that we can't conceive of, but let that pass. But the idea is that we go through this earthly life and through that acquire a character, as Richard was saying. When we do good, it makes it easier to do good the next time, and so forth. And those who are fortunate enough to get to heaven, they've already acquired that character. And so in heaven, you haven't got the same liability for things to go horribly wrong. But the trouble is, those starving babies, or those who were eliminated in gas chambers when they were still children, didn't get the chance to develop that character. So I don't see how it's possible, logically possible, if you like, for a God to make their lives worthwhile posthumously. And that seems to me to be a serious moral problem. But anyway, overall, I think the problem of evil is the crucial problem. But again, I want to emphasize that you've got this very simple and elegant theory, and I don't deny it is simple and elegant and ingeniously worked out. And by the way, I'm absolutely certain that Richard is entirely sincere when he talks about not treating these moral issues frivolously. When we discuss these things on a theoretical level, it may seem, sort of callous, but I think that accusation would be quite unfair. But the problem is that in order to encompass the phenomena that we see, we have to stretch this theory so much, we have to give it so many degrees of freedom that it ends up completely imprecise in what it predicts. And in particular, I think it's the predictions that it yields, as I said, equally compatible with the hypothesis of a God, if there is one, who cares nothing for good or evil. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's it for tonight. No more questions. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to welcome you all in joining me in applause for Professor Millican and Professor.